Good morning, and welcome to this, our first podcast of Memoirs of a Psychiatrist. I'm Sharad Wagley, your host, and I'm here in the studio with Lou. And Lou, I am most grateful to you for walking me through this entire process.
Good day, Doctor. I'm looking forward to this. As I said, I think this is going to pay back for me, too, because this is a subject that fascinates me. So this is going to be an interesting journey.
I have learned a lot from you, Lou, in terms of this process, and I thank you for that. I've been in psychiatry since 1972, so that's close to 50 years. I started in 1972 as a first-year psychiatry resident, and at this stage of my life, people have often told me that the stories that I tell them about my experiences in the last 50 years or so have been fascinating to them, and they suggested I either write them down or do a podcast. People read less these days and listen more to podcasts and watch. That I should do this so that people can benefit from my experiences, and I thought that was a good idea. So I appreciate the opportunity, Lou, to come here and do this.
I think they're going to benefit, but I also think they're going to be entertained because there's just some fascinating stuff here.
I'm so glad you said that. So yeah, it's 50 years worth of experiences, and in the beginning, the first, I would say, 15 or 20 years, hypnosis played a large part in my career. I did not want to be termed a hypnotist, but I was doing hypnosis from my first year in psychiatry residency, and I was able to use it to treat multiple personalities and cases that you don't see as much today. Multiple personalities, conversion disorders, conversion reactions, which means basically the mind says, I can't see, I'm blind. When
interesting.
There's nothing really wrong with his or her eyesight.
Hysterical blindness?
Hysterical blindness,
yeah.
Conversion disorders, or being paralyzed. And those things were much more common back in the early 70s.
Why do you think that's so? Especially like multiple personality disorders.
Well, that takes us into a whole other area, which is more technical. I'd rather not go into that at this point, Lou, because I think people will lose interest. I think we'd rather get to the hypnosis part. But I was able to treat these. These were much more receptive to hypnosis. We didn't have medications back then as we do now. And psychotherapy, which was much more used, was less effective with these than hypnosis. Hypnosis almost had a 1 or 2 day immediate cure. So
amazing,
it was fascinating that a person would be brought into the hospital. I was a resident, first-year resident. People would be brought into the hospital, and a day or two later, the person was quote-unquote cured of their blindness or their paralysis, which people found fascinating. But I used it to do that. I used it to treat conversion disorders, multiple personalities, which then, hospitals were small then, 300 beds. Everybody knew me. Yeah. I was there in the hospital all the time. I was single. I was alone. I would spend all my time in the hospital. I was fascinated by psychiatry and the mind. And so this podcast basically is to tell people all the experiences I've had in the last 50 or so years, to entertain, like you said, but basically also to teach this to the medical community, to say what the benefits of using the mind are. I used it then to treat psychosomatic disorders, ulcerative colitis, asthma, migraine headaches, skin disorders, etc. Also, the severe pain of cancer I was able to alleviate for those who are hypnotizable with hypnosis. And then, ultimately, I used hypnosis to save a life in the ICU. That'll come up in one of our future podcasts, I think. And then, as it turned out, the person whose life I saved, his physician, happened to be the medical examiner for the county, for Bergen County.
Really?
And he was a non-believer in psychiatry, didn't believe anything about psychiatry. He couldn't believe that I saved his patient's life, who the priest had already been there to read him his last rites, and the family was crying outside. And so when the first murder that I was aware of, that I was called in for, there were no clues. And the police didn't know who to call, so Dr. Denson suggested they call me. I hypnotized one lone witness of something that they'd seen in the parking lot, and we were able to catch the murderer, who happens to still be in prison and incarcerated 50 years later. So that's going to be the course of the podcast for the next few sessions. But as you had said, everybody has a spark that causes them to go into certain things.
And as we've talked, I've been kind of amateurishly fascinated with hypnosis for a long time. So when you came to me, when we met, and a person with your credentials, a psychiatrist, a medical professional, practicing hypnosis, you don't normally see that. So this is a really interesting combination. So I'm curious how you arrived there.
That's what this podcast today is going to be about, which is how I got fascinated by hypnosis. And then in future podcasts, what I'd like to do is to tell you that this is not all about hypnosis, because hypnosis was my earlier part when I was in my 20s, and subsequent to that, I had a lot of other sparks in my life. Which I'll talk about. And the final spark was about 15 years ago when my wife urged me to attend a lecture by a person that she had gone to hear, and she said, "This will change your life," and it did. She was so right. She knows me from the time we were like 12 years old, and she was so right. It had changed my life and the life of my patients and those around me. So that's where I will talk about towards the end of these series of podcasts.
That's where we're headed.
That's where we're headed in the long run.
But we got to start at the beginning.
Well, we start at the beginning. You're right, Lou. And so the beginning is where, just a little bit of background. When I was in 8th grade, I met my wife. And from 8th grade until 11th grade, I just saw her as a thing to torment and torture. I hadn't thought of girls and anything like that at the time, just that they were objects to torture. And in 11th grade, suddenly, I guess, my eyes opened up and I saw her to be one of the most beautiful women, nice personalities, nice person. And I said, I have to marry her. And so I told her that in the long run, I will get married to you when we're able to and we're old enough. And as it happened, she stayed in medical school in New Delhi, where I was in school with her. And then I moved to Mumbai, about 1,500 miles away. But it might as well have been a continent away at that time in 1965, because the only way to get back and forth was by train. And the train took 24 hours one way.
Wow.
One way, 24 hours.
Holy cow.
And usually the temperature was like 110 degrees. It was hot. I was in the lowest 3rd class, no seat, standing in the doorway for 24 hours in the hot, dusty thing.
No seat?
Yeah, I mean, you had to pay more to buy a seat.
Yeah.
So I would go to the local library and pick out a book and take with me. But books were scarce. So I got the only book that was left, which was Freud's Psychoanalysis. And so it was tough reading. But to get away from the heat, I was reading this slowly. And if you ever get a chance, you should read it. It's fascinating, Freud's book.
And you had no leanings this way before. It was just that was the book that was left.
That's right. Yeah. I had no leanings. I was actually in medical school. This was towards the final year of my school. We were all choosing what professions to go into, what specialties to go into. And my friends were thinking about the more lucrative fields like surgery, obstetrics, gynecology, dermatology, stuff like that. And I also had thought of that. But there were things that were making me lean towards psychiatry, but this sort of clinched it, this book, because it made me think about how much the mind was capable of. But I still was on the fence. When I came back from my trip to Delhi, there was a hypnotist in town. His name was Max Colley. Max Colley was from Scotland, and he had a huge audience. And we had heard about it in the newspapers, and everybody was talking about it because he had an auditorium as big as the Javits Center in New York. Thousands and thousands of people there. And the tickets were expensive. And
you weren't necessarily looking for a hypnotist. It was the show that was in town. This was the event.
This was the event. This was the show. I didn't know much about hypnosis other than what colloquially people know about. But all the famous film stars of Bollywood were always there. And so we, 20 years old, said, we've got to go there to see these film stars. So we actually bought tickets up in the stratosphere. Yeah. And they were less expensive than the ones all the way up front. And we were told that if you volunteered and you
Yeah, you weren't going to see the big stars from up there, were you?
no.
Yeah.
So if you volunteered, you would be on stage, and yes, you'd catch a glimpse of the film stars in the first couple rows, but he also then gave you passes to a future show where you could sit in the front row
Oh, nice.
because you sacrificed your one time and you were a guinea pig. So we said, but how do we know he's going to pick us? So we went to the show and we walked in. There had been no terroristic incidents
Yeah.
back in 1970.
He wasn't going to pick you from the back row of the theater.
For sure.
Yeah.
So we devised a plan, the four of us, that we were going to get to be the volunteers that he picked. So we got in there. There were no security guards at that time. There were mostly ushers.
Yeah.
So we pretended we'd lost some jewelry on the floor, on the carpet, right in front of the main entrance to the auditorium.
No, too funny.
Yeah, and then the ushers came, said, "What did you lose?" And we said, "We lost some jewelry." So everybody's down on their hands and knees, crouching around looking for some jewelry. Don't forget, I wouldn't do this now, but at that time we were all 20, and
Yeah.
this alone was a lark for us.
Sure.
All of a sudden, we hear
And you had a plan.
We had a plan. Max Colley was on the stage, and his booming voice with his Scottish accent, he said, "Welcome to everybody," and then he says, "Now I'm looking for some volunteers." Immediately we got up. The ushers were still looking for this imagined jewelry. We ran down the aisles,
Yeah.
and I still remember Max Colley in his booming voice saying, "Oh, look what we have here, 4 strapping young lads coming up as volunteers." So we went up. We were the only 4. Maybe there were some others, I don't remember. But he tried to hypnotize all of us. I myself wasn't hypnotized, my other friend wasn't. He said, "Go on down." So we went, we just found some vacant seats in the front. We just sat there.
Yeah.
And the next couple of hours, we saw the most fascinating things. And this was actually
He had them hypnotized for a couple hours?
Yes.
Yeah, wow.
2 of my friends that I knew wouldn't be putting this on.
Right.
He had them first. He was doing a lot of very funny things like hypnotists do, pretending to be a chicken or being chased by a dog or smelling some bad odors or things like that, which had the audience cracking up. But then he said, "I want to show you what the mind can do to the body." And one of my friends, if you had asked him to do 2 push-ups, he couldn't. So that friend,
Not an athlete.
not an athlete,
Yeah.
and not in good physical shape.
Yeah.
He had him put his head on one chair and his heels on another. And then he said, "When I touch you, your body will rise up off the ground and become straight,
Wow.
like a plank."
Yeah.
And he touched him, and immediately he straightened out. He was like a plank. And he said, "Now I'm going to have 3 people stand on top of you." And I kid you not, he had people from the audience. Actually, you can go to YouTube and you can see Max Colley over there. He's not alive anymore, but at that time. 3 people from the audience came and stood on top of my friend and
Stood on top of him while
on
he's
his
suspended.
body in midair.
Yeah, wow.
The next day, he had no soreness. He didn't even remember after the episode that this had happened to him.
Wow.
He didn't know.
Yeah.
And the next day, he was not sore or anything. He also took sterilized needles, and he told my friends he was going to touch them with a feather. When he actually poked these needles into their arms, and then he asked for any physicians in the audience. In India, you have lots and lots of physicians. So they all went up to the stage. I didn't. They looked at it. He pulled out the needles, and he said, "You are not going to bleed." And there was no bleeding. Now, as a final year medical student, I was shocked.
Yeah.
I was shocked.
That was pretty surprising.
Yeah, you could actually do that. And as it turned out, now we've all read articles about acupuncture, how they use it in China, and they control bleeding with
Right.
acupuncture and stuff like that, things that we wouldn't believe. But as the audience will see, I found that hypnosis can do a lot of things that one would never believe. So after that, my friends came out of the hypnosis. They came back down. We were fascinated. Everybody was clapping. We had a great time. The last thing on my mind as I left that auditorium was Bollywood actors and Bollywood actresses.
Yeah, the people you came to see.
That was the furthest thing away from my
Yeah.
mind. What was fascinating to me is what he had done by his use of hypnosis to my friends to use their minds to control their body. And this was fascinating to me,
Yeah.
how a person could be so strong as to have 3 people. The mind did that. How he could put a needle in his arm and not have any bleeding. So that was the spark, Lou, as you said, that led me towards hypnosis. And
the power of the mind.
Power of the mind. I was 20 years old at the time. I was fascinated. I said, I've got to learn this hypnosis. And as in the future podcasts you will see, I basically learned hypnosis, got to be pretty good at it. I wasn't engaged to my wife, but in my mind, I was coming back. I was going to the United States and getting my green card, coming back and getting married. That took 2 years. So when I came here, I said, I've got to go back and then bring my wife back here.
Right.
So I had all the time in the world. I would be in the hospital all day and night. The hospital had given me an apartment across the street, very cute little apartment. I was there. I was frequently in the hospital.
Yep. You were just there all day.
All day. I didn't drink. I didn't smoke. I didn't do anything like that. So work was fun for me. So the next few episodes we'll talk about, I think in the next episode I'd like to talk about what I did with hypnosis in my first year as a resident.
Or what hypnosis did with you.
Or what hypnosis did with me and patients. It was, so that the audience can know what the mind is capable of. And then we'll go on from there. And that's it. So
I want people to like the Facebook page, Memoirs of a Psychiatrist. Share it with your friends, with people who might be interested in this subject. If you like the page, you'll get notices when we put videos up. You can go to the video section on the left-hand side of the Facebook page and look at the entire catalog and catch up on past episodes as you go along, or catch up on future episodes if you're getting here a little late. And we'll be doing Facebook Live videos from time to time. So if you like the page, you'll get a notification when we're going to go live, and you can interact with the doctor as well.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.